That phrase touched off mass demonstrations and rioting all over America. The death of George Floyd in Minneapolis inflamed passions, not just because the act was so outrageous. It was because for many African Americans, it felt too familiar. Tensions between minorities and the police have existed for years. Black parents across the economic spectrum have had the talk with their sons in the hope of avoiding deadly confrontations.
Get home safely.
Your goal is to get home safely. I'm sorry.
Some of these same communities need the help of police to combat crime and violence. And police are sometimes stymied by a lack of cooperation. Changes are taking place. The Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department has approved new restrictions regarding use of force. But how do we build new bridges of trust between police and the public? Is it possible to create better partnerships to make neighborhoods safer? We'll look for answers in this installment of Where Do We Go From Here? Hello, I'm WFYI newscaster Terry D, along with Indianapolis Recorder editor Oshia Boyd. The history of relations between the police and African Americans has been difficult throughout the country. A single incident can ignite a tinderbox.
That happened this summer in Indianapolis, but the outcry has prompted a series of reforms within the police department, while city officials work on additional measures to improve accountability. But will these actions create fundamental changes?
We'll pose these questions to our guests: Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department Chief Randall Taylor, Indianapolis City County Council President Bob Osley, journalist Ebony Chappelle, who works as Program and Communications Manager for Leadership Indianapolis, and Rosie Bryant, lead community organizer for Faith in Indiana. Let's go ahead and get started with the questions. Oshia?
Thank you. Chief Taylor, can you provide an update on the IMP review panel? Have there been further discussions between IMPD and community leaders who were critical of the panel selections?
Well, the discussion has really been more with the council and President Osley in particular. We're waiting to find out what the makeup of that advisory board is going to be. I know we're confident that there'll be 4 sworn members of that board and 5 civilian community members. There are prerequisites for the community members, things that we want them to have knowledge of prior to being on that advisory board, but we've made arrangements to get them through that and get those prerequisites met so that they have an understanding of how the police department works and the kind of issues that our officers face on a daily basis.
President Osley, can you give us an update?
Sure, thank you so much. And just really appreciate being here today with you. Yes, we've been working with IMPD and the administration, and then our next view, our next set of actions, we'll be working with individuals like Rosie and members of our community, just to make sure that they have a sense of buy-in on the selection process. And then we will turn it back over to the administration to work with IMPD and with Chief Taylor.
Thank you.
One of the components of the creation of the IMPD review panel was more community involvement when there are controversial issues that come up in the community. And this is for either Chief Taylor or President Osley. Why is the answer to community distrust of police more police? Why do you think there's a lack of cooperation in the community for the community to provide information when they know a crime has been committed?
Well, I think thinking from the police standpoint, we recognize that people that sometimes have knowledge of crimes live in those areas. I imagine there is a little bit of a fear that if they cooperate with us, that there could be some retaliation and that we may not be able to protect them. The thing that we stress in understanding that, the thing that we stress though is if we want to solve these crimes, we have to have communication and cooperation from the community at large. You've always heard the see something, say something. In order for us to get on top of that and get crime out of a neighborhood, we have to have the community's cooperation with that so we can investigate and make those arrests and help to make that better. But I understand that can be a difficult choice for some, and we do our best to try to help out with that. But I imagine, like I said, fear of retaliation is probably at the forefront of why people may feel they can't speak up in some of those cases.
Ebony, what concerns are you hearing from community members?
So many. There are so many different concerns that I'm hearing from the community when it comes to some of the recent dealings with police and some of the actions that the city has taken, or even inaction that the city has taken to address some of the issues that are going on. I think one of the biggest things that the community is having an issue with is a perceived lack of transparency from IMPD, particularly when it comes to things like police action shootings, like the one we saw with Drajon Reed. There are a lot of people that are feeling that there is a lack of transparency. A lot of people are also very conflicted about something that happened last week, and that was the rolling out of Operation Legend. We understand that that is a federal operation to bring more resources and things to the city, and the city didn't necessarily have a say in that, but still it's police and what it is that they're doing when they come into the community. So a lot of people are very conflicted on that as well. And those are just two of the many concerns that the community has.
What improvements or differences are expected with the implementation of Operation Legend? And is 45 days an effective length of time to achieve the targeted objectives?
Operation Legend is something that, even though it wasn't called that, we have had instances where we're in communities in order to try to lower the crime rate. I'm always going to be pro lowering crime and how it affects individuals in different areas. And so this is nothing new. 45 days is what our federal partners came up with, feeling that was an effective time frame to be able to run this, because it will be very aggressive. But again, this is not going into neighborhoods to harass people. These are people who have been identified as being part of a criminal element. And I think every citizen deserves to live in a community without those fears. So whether or not it's from the federal or the state or local, we owe it to the community to work on those things and try to get crime out of our community. The only thing I can say is, the people that I hear speak about it are thankful for those efforts, and I think we'll have a good impact in helping out with that as we move forward through these 45 days.
I was not engaged in any way with Operation Legend, and so learned about it, I think, the same way that others did. So I can't answer, either about its effectiveness or whether 45 days is enough time to achieve the targeted objectives. I mean, it's a question that I have as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah. So, our goal here at Faith in Indiana is to actually move more resources away from the police and instead invest in strategies that actually work. Like time and time again, study shows that when you invest in the community, that's what keeps families safe. It's time for cities like Indianapolis to really create robust crisis interventions and other interventions that really keep the community safe, because that's actually not the job of the police. The job of police should be focused on unsolved crimes and other police works that make sense for them, and making sure we have a holistic approach to actually addressing the issues in the community. Implementing strategies like GVI that we've been working on for the last few years actually focuses on reducing gun violence by targeting the individuals that we believe to be responsible for driving our gun violence in the city, and places a holistic approach. This strategy has been implemented in places like Oakland, who in the first 18 months of its implementation had a reduction of 35% in gun violence, and now they're up to over 50%. And if implemented well and effectively in Indianapolis, we could see those same results.
Thank you, Rosie. You actually bring up a really good point, and that's why I want to turn to you, Chief Taylor. are police required to do too much social work? And will allocating funds to different community organizations help ease the burden on police?
Well, I believe that, yeah, there's areas that our officers have had to get into out of necessity. You know, a lot of times people bring up mental health or social issues and those kind of things. I'm fine with us backing out of those things. I don't necessarily agree with taking that money from the police department in order to accomplish that. I think some of my concern with that is if you're going to remove money from our budget in order to try to solve some of these problems, let's say with mental health, then our officers need to be able to be out of that lane, right? We need to be able to step away from that. I believe my fear is that sometimes with mental health issues, there's violence associated with that, and then our officers have to come right back into it. So could there be a balance in there? I'm sure there could be. And as I've said before, there's things that our officers are required to do out of necessity that I would agree maybe don't need to be in our purview. And I'm certainly willing to discuss those things. Like I said, where I have issues is if you're defunding the police, you have to understand any money that comes out of that budget is going to affect the community in some way and not necessarily in a positive way.
Chief Taylor, you've brought up the term defund, and there's been a lot of talk about that, not only here in Indianapolis, but in police departments around the country. And even though defunding is not on the table, can it be a long-term strategy for Indianapolis?
Not in my mind, not if we're going to say defunding. Now, if we're going to reimagine some part of policing, and like I say, if you can show me that there's a certain part of our budget that could be spent better doing something else that releases our officers from having to deal with that, then I'm certainly willing to discuss those things and listen to those things.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
There. You know, in some of the work that I've done, we've talked with people in the community that are very actively pursuing this type of thing, which is to defund the police and use some of those funds to fund community programs that could help to alleviate some of the things that police are involved in, like mental health issues that they don't necessarily need to be. One of the biggest things that people bring up when they say that is that to talk about reimagining or restructuring a system that at its foundational core has a lot of issues when it comes to over-policing, when it comes to excessive uses of force, when it comes to being agents of systemic oppression in the community. People are saying you can't just reimagine on the outskirts of this thing. It has to be a very deep and structural change that has to happen in order for us to become a society where policing is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, which is protecting and serving the people.
Mr. Osley, do you see pros and cons with defunding the police? So
I want us to be careful about the term defunding. I want us to know that, I want us to consider where are we putting our resources? Let's just call it that. And how are those resources best utilized? You know, we have a program that I know has been incredibly successful, and I hope that we can expand it, and that is the MCAP program. You know, the Mobile Crisis Assistance Teams, which focus on mental health issues, you know, issues of substance abuse, that gets folks with our arms wrapped around, you know, individuals who need the help, so that we can then help them move on with their lives. Ultimately, I think that is a society that we all want. You know, I mean, obviously we deal with the folks who have ill intent, the bad guys, but there are a whole bunch of folks who are in the mix right now who shouldn't even be in the mix. And if I think we were smart about how we use all of our resources, we would have less folks in the mix and more folks, I think, who are out there, you know, leading our communities, you know, in health and in safety. That's the focus that I've got. And that's the focus that fellow council members have. When we look at our budget for this year, for next year, and we look at the budgets going forward, those are the kinds of things that we are looking to shape our decisions around.
And I just want to highlight what Osley just said. So, at Faith in Indiana, that was one of the things that we pushed and advocated for, was the impact strategy. And when it was piloted on the near east side, it saw a reduction already of 30% in our incarceration rates, because the majority of people, if we're honest, that are in prison actually don't belong there. Majority of them are actually dealing with mental illness and addiction. And as a licensed social worker, we are trained to actually deal with these individuals. And the police, this shouldn't be a part of their job description, right? Like, you have trained professionals that can actually deal with these issues, even the ones that are actually violent, right? And these strategies, it creates a way to get people into treatment instead of incarceration, so that we're not penalizing people for having a mental illness or drug addiction.
So let's stay here for just a couple more minutes. Ebony and Rosie, what are some actions that can be taken right now to improve the relationship between the police and the Black community, especially as we talk about restructuring or reimagining the police department?
One that I wanted to share is something that was actually shared on the radio this past Sunday. I hope to co-host a show here locally. And one of the callers called in and said, wouldn't it be great if we had officers that lived in the communities that they policed? And I thought that was very interesting. And I recall that being a proposed strategy of IMPD a few years ago under a different administration. And I would like to know where that landed, or if it's something that they've considered again. The caller thought that it would just be impactful to have police actually in the neighborhoods that they were serving, so that people understood them, they knew them, and they were able to build some sort of rapport. I think it all comes down to relationship building. I don't believe that the police are going anywhere as far as their role in our society. So at this point, I think it's very crucial to look at how can we make everyone work together in a cohesive manner.
Chief Taylor, that's been a suggestion that's been tossed around frequently, having the officers live in the communities that they patrol. Is that something that's being discussed now? Is that something that you have thought about as chief to revive?
Well, I think that's a little bit of a difficult question. Obviously, we have officers that do live in Marion County, me being one of them. When I came here, it was a requirement to live within Marion County. Now, I'm not required to live, when I was with the Sheriff's Department and patrolled the streets, I worked in a number of areas, but I was not mandated or necessarily encouraged to live there. But I did live within Marion County because I care about Marion County. That's not to say our officers that live outside of the county care any less. That was one of the reasons why we looked into expanding our beat patrol, to have those officers in those beats and being able to get out of their car and have conversations with the people that live there. You know, there's a lot of variables that go into why people choose to live where they live. And I don't know necessarily that living exactly where you work is in the best interest of all the officers. We certainly don't put anything into place that would dissuade them from living there. Like I said, we have officers that live all through Marion County and those that live outside of it. So currently, no, there is no push that to live in a particular beat or anything like that. Officers are allowed to choose to live just like the rest of the community is allowed to choose to live where they feel comfortable and where they can afford.
Thank you. President Osley.
I just want to add something to that, if you guys don't mind.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the goal is to save lives, right? And what's going to improve the relationship with the police and the community is when Black people are treated like human beings. And when this is done, you can actually do that. We've had some progress on that so far. Like in the Reed case, we didn't have a standing in that situation. But now we do, because we've changed the use of force policy where de-escalation is actually required, right? And now if police officers don't adhere to that, that's a standing that we now have to stand on to actually get rid of bad acting police officers in the department.
Thank you. When we talk about bad acting officers in the department, there's been a lot of focus on that, Chief Taylor. So how is morale?
Well, you know, I don't, I've spoken to a number of officers. Some feel pretty good. Some are a little discouraged. I think part of that has to do with the fact that right now it appears that a lot of people look at the police as the bad guy, and no one considers the thousands of contacts that we have with the public on a regular basis where things go very well. Those things aren't looked at, and measures to punish the police for the actions of a few is difficult for anybody to take, because I would venture to say a far majority of my officers do the right thing at the right time and for the right reasons. Yet things that happen in Minneapolis, they're looked at as, oh, we've done those same things. Now, I'm not saying we haven't made mistakes as police officers, but it's just like anyone else. You don't want to be because you're a particular race or something like that. You don't want to be looked at in a group because one or two or three people have acted badly out of that group. Everyone wants to be treated fairly because of their own actions, and that's the same thing that our officers are looking for. We do our best to hold officers to a standard, and if those standards aren't met, then discipline up to termination does come with that. But I can speak frankly and honestly that I believe the Indianapolis Police Department as a whole does do the right thing, and the community can take confidence in their officers.
Something that I wanted to add, can I add something there?
Sure.
Okay, just hearing Chief Taylor's response, I wondered what he thought about the fact that, you know, last week there were dozens of officers that said that they would, you know, walk off of their job because of 2 officers being reprimanded for being those bad actors, and how he thinks that plays a role into the community having trust for police.
Well, I would say, you know, I have to be cautious with this because obviously there's a criminal trial that's going to happen on this, but I would take a wait and see approach as to whether or not those officers are found guilty. I said in the beginning of that particular incident that I didn't like the way that looked. That doesn't necessarily mean that I agree that it was criminal in nature, but I think officers are concerned with the actions they take, especially if those actions appear to be within policy. Yeah, there's some that said that they would leave the ERG group, but it hasn't been as many as possibly would have been expected. I think people have to realize those officers are out there doing the best they can in very, very difficult times. And I don't know that the public fully understands what they're up against. Now, that's not condoning bad actions on our behalf, but I think those things do have to be taken into consideration.
If I may say something at this point, is that all right?
Yes,
Sure.
please.
This is why it is so important that we get community engagement, even down to policy level. One, it provides a transparency, and then the justification from a community perspective on what we think is appropriate and what we don't think is appropriate. And when we don't have that, then it is basically a wall built up that no one can see through to understand why is this even tolerable. So the work that is coming down the pike that we've all been aware of, and we've had a number of discussions with the chief, Rosie and others, the hope is that we'll be able to crack that wall and be able to cross over that wall so that there will be community buy-in, community engagement. Like what does a community believe is an appropriate set of actions? That's where we need to be. So that, I think in many ways, that also helps to build trust when we're working together and we are implementing policy and a future together. around the table. We won't always agree. I mean, that's just human behavior. That's just life. But it is important, however, that we are together in the crafting of policy.
President Osley, you make a very valid point. Part of the issue is the trust, building the trust within the community. How do we then build the trust, and as to Ebony's point, transparency, to get the community involved, to even want to be involved? What are the steps we need to take to make that happen?
Can I answer that question?
Please.
Yeah, so I think the community wants to be involved. It's seen. We saw the youth and lots of people out in the streets. People are looking for something to do. They want a direction, and we are doing just that. When the George Floyd and the Reed case happened, some of our Black clergy and youth, they came together, like Rashad Jones of Sanders Temple Church was in the streets with the youth, not there to preach to them, not there to tell them what to do, but just there to provide support and what they need. Sarah Skipper, young, a 25-year-old young adult who goes and attends Crossroads AME, was in the streets and walking and marching. The difference is like we got to move from the streets into the halls of power, and we've done just that. Like Bob said, you know, the real change comes when the community are a part of creating the policies that Chief Randall said that allows people to make certain decisions that shouldn't be, right? So the change comes in actually changing the policies.
All right, we have a little time left. I would like to ask this question of all the panelists, and please keep your comment brief and to the point. What do you think it takes for Indianapolis to move forward based on what has occurred these past few months in terms of police and community relations?
Well, I would say that what I would hope for is that we do have valid communications going back and forth. But I want to make sure that those communications and what is said is based on factual evidence and what really happened in a number of situations, not speculations as to what was there. I think we have to be cautious about the information that is put out on certain things, and I would apologize to the community. I certainly understand why people would be concerned about transparency on the department. Some of that is outside of my control at this point. But my goal truly looking forward is hopefully we never have a situation like we've had before with Mr. Reed or some of the other incidents. But if we do, the goal would be, of course, to get information out quicker, if at all possible. I think people are going to see that what they may have think happened isn't necessarily what really happened. And I think as long as we're going down that path of using the truth, then I think we can have those good communications, and that, of course, will then build the trust. And they'll realize that, look, the IMPD is not against anybody. We're for the community. We're part of the community, and our goal is to protect that community.
We appreciate your answers. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, and we'd like to thank our guests, IMPD Chief Randall Taylor, City County Council President Bob Osley, Ebony Chappelle, and Rosie Bryant.
WFYI and the Indianapolis Recorder will continue to explore issues regarding healthcare, employment, and housing in future shows.
We hope you'll join us for more discussions. And where do we go from here?